Dad ditched my wedding for my brother's camping trip, so I had my stepfather walk me instead. Now he's begging for a do-over after seeing the photos. Yesterday, I got married. It was a beautiful day, and by the time everything had wrapped up in the evening, my dad finally decided to show up. We had a conversation, one that ended with him in tears, and now I can't shake this awful feeling about it. To give some background, my fiancé and I got engaged about 5 months ago. Neither of us wanted a massive wedding with a crowd of people in some fancy venue, so we settled on something small and intimate right in our backyard, surrounded by close family and friends. We wanted to keep things simple and personal. On top of that, we had chosen to get married on a meaningful date, our 4th anniversary, so moving the wedding around wasn't really an option. Even though it was a small gathering, we had already made arrangements with decorators and caterers, which meant rescheduling would have been a logistical nightmare. But more than that, I just didn't want to. There was no real reason to. My dad wasn't asking me to move the wedding because of some emergency or something significant. He wanted me to change the date because my golden child brother had come into town and had planned a camping trip that same weekend. Yeah, I wish I were making that up. Even if I tried, I don't think I could come up with something that ridiculous. A week before the wedding, my dad called me and told me he couldn't make it. His excuse? A medical emergency. It didn't take much for me to see right through that. I couldn't think of a single medical issue that would conveniently require a whole week's delay but somehow couldn't be rescheduled. So, I pressed him on it, kept asking until he finally admitted the truth. He had agreed to go on that camping trip my brother had planned, and, unfortunately for me, it overlapped with my wedding. I mean, the choice here should have been obvious, right? But for my dad, it wasn't even a question. My brother only comes home for a couple of weeks each year, and in his eyes, spending time with him took priority over attending my wedding. He actually tried to convince me that moving the wedding would be easy since it was small anyway, just a matter of informing a few people and rearranging the vendors. I tried explaining to him how much this date meant to me, but after going back and forth for a while, it became painfully clear that the conversation was pointless. His mind was made up, he was going on that trip. Honestly, I wasn't even shocked. He had always chosen my brother over me. My brother, who's 30 now, is 3 years older than me and has been an overachiever his entire life. Meanwhile, I was just average. Naturally, he was the one who got all the attention. He was constantly praised, while I was more or less overlooked. As a kid, I used to feel jealous of him. I wanted to be happy for his success, but it was hard when he was such a self-absorbed brat with an ego the size of a house. He knew he was great at a lot of things, and all that praise over the years had made him arrogant. He genuinely thought he was some kind of gift to humanity. To put it bluntly, he was insufferable. On top of that, he was also a bit of a bully toward me, which meant we never really got along. So, when he left for college, I was more than happy to see him go. Our parents got divorced when I was in middle school. It was a messy split, and the bitterness lingered long after. Turns out, my mom had been having an affair with an old friend from college, and that was the final straw. Even so, my dad agreed to a shared custody arrangement, despite everything. If I'm being honest, the divorce didn't come as a shock to anyone. What caught us off guard was the affair itself. But my parents separating? That had been a long time coming. As far back as I can remember, they were always at odds. Even my happiest childhood memories don't include them being happy together. When we were out in public, on vacations, or during holidays, they'd put on an act for the sake of appearances, but behind closed doors, things were different. There were stretches where they barely spoke to each other, avoided eye contact altogether, and even slept in separate rooms. At some point, they just fell out of love, and neither of them made an effort to fix things. So, when my mom cheated, I wasn't excusing it, but I also wasn't entirely surprised. That particular phase of their marriage was especially rough. They were constantly fighting, loud, vicious arguments, almost daily. And my dad? He started drinking, which only made everything worse. Eventually, my mom came clean about the affair and walked out. Still, she tried to stay in touch with both of us. The thing is, I was the only one who responded. My brother refused to speak to her, never forgave her for cheating on our dad. I guess that was expected. The two of them had always had a close bond, even when we were little. It was always obvious to me that my dad had a favorite, even though he swore up and down that he didn't. His actions spoke louder than his words, and as we grew up, it became even more apparent. My relationship with my dad had always been rocky, and after the divorce, things only got worse. When I chose to maintain a decent relationship with my mom and stepdad, I think my dad started to resent me for it. He grew distant, probably because he expected me to act like my brother, bad-mouthing our mother and her new husband at every opportunity. My mom remarried just a few months after the divorce was finalized, and I was one of her bridesmaids. My brother, on the other hand, refused to even attend. But since my mom still had partial custody of us, he had no choice but to spend half the month at her house, whether he liked it or not. Those weeks were unbearable. He was always in a foul mood, probably because, for the first time in his life, he wasn't the favorite. My mother treated us equally, and I think that rubbed him the wrong way because he couldn't get away with his usual entitled behavior. My dad, of course, saw things differently. He was convinced that my mom and stepdad were mistreating my brother, so he tried to file for full custody multiple times. But his claims had no real basis, so he never succeeded. Looking back, I'm grateful for that. At least with my mom, I had one parent who genuinely cared about me. My stepdad was a decent guy too. I never had any reason to dislike him. I was still pretty young and confused about how I was supposed to feel about my mom, especially knowing she had cheated on my dad. But after a while, I decided that I just needed to do whatever made me happy. And having a good relationship with her made me happy. I put in the effort to stay close to her, and I don't regret it for a second. 6 years ago, we lost her to cancer. Even now, I'm grateful for every moment I got to spend with her. No matter what happened in her marriage, she was always a good mother to me, and that's what really mattered. Even in her final days, my brother was barely around. At least he visited her a couple of times, which I guess brought her some peace before she passed. A few months after she was gone, my stepdad moved out of state, but we've kept in touch. About a year later, my brother took a job that required him to relocate to London. He's been living there ever since, only coming back once a year to visit my dad for a couple of weeks, which is why he's here now. My brother and I don't speak anymore, but after my mom's passing and my brother moving overseas, my dad and I actually started to rebuild our relationship. He apologized for how cold he'd been to me after the divorce. He admitted that he had felt betrayed and hurt back then and that, in the process, he had treated me in ways he wasn't proud of. More importantly, he finally acknowledged what I had always known, that he had spent my entire life prioritizing my brother and neglecting me. But he said he wanted to change, and we worked on it. Over the past few years, we actually got along better than I ever thought we would. I really believed things had turned around, which is why I asked him to walk me down the aisle at my wedding. He agreed, and for a while, I let myself think that maybe, just maybe, things were different now. I knew he was still deeply attached to my brother, but that was fine as long as he treated me like a daughter he actually cared about. But after what happened recently, I realized the truth. I was only a priority to him when my brother wasn't around. The only reason he had even put effort into fixing things with me was because my brother had moved away. Now that he was back, I didn't matter as much. That realization stung. I could hardly believe my dad had the nerve to ask me to reschedule my wedding just so he could go on a camping trip with my brother. In that moment, I did the only thing that felt right. I told him I would delay the wedding. It was a heat-of-the-moment decision, but the second I hung up the phone, I was already making another call. This time, it was to my stepdad. Without even thinking, I asked him to walk me down the aisle instead. At the time, I was furious. I won't deny that what I did was petty. It was pure revenge, plain and simple. But in that moment, it felt justified. I convinced myself I was doing the right thing for me, for my own peace of mind. My stepdad was already invited to the wedding as a guest anyway, and as I mentioned, I never had any issues with him. He was the one who got me through my mom's funeral, the one person who was there for me when I needed someone. We don't talk all the time, but we're still close enough. When I first asked him, he hesitated. I could tell he was skeptical, probably because he knew my dad would be there too. But I managed to get him on board. I didn't think too hard about it. I figured that, even if what I was doing was a little spiteful, my dad deserved it. My fiancé agreed with me, and at the time, that was all the validation I needed. For the past week, my dad barely kept in touch, and I knew exactly why. My brother was in town, which meant I was on the back burner again. That just made me even more determined. Then, yesterday, my wedding day finally arrived, and, as expected, my dad wasn't there. Even though I had prepared myself for it, a small part of me kept hoping that, at the last minute, he'd change his mind. That maybe, somehow, he'd show up. But he didn't. So my stepdad walked me down the aisle, and I'm happy he did. It was my wedding day, and despite everything, I was happy. The only thing that didn't go as planned was what happened afterward. I sent my dad a picture of me being walked down the aisle by my stepdad, expecting him to be angry. What I didn't expect was for him to immediately get on the next bus and come back home. He came all the way back just to talk to me. That's what happened. And now, after everything that unfolded last night, I can't help but feel guilty. Earlier that day, I had asked my cousin to take a picture of me on my phone while I was walking down the aisle, and I sent it to my dad. She did as I asked, and a couple of hours later, he must have seen it, though at first, there was no response. I thought that was a little odd, but between the wedding lunch and everything else going on, I didn't dwell on it. Then, around 8 p.m., when most of the guests had left and things were winding down, my dad finally showed up. My brother was with him, and both of them looked completely drained. But it was my dad who did all the talking. He told me he was sorry, deeply sorry, for not taking my wedding seriously. Now that he was here, he wanted me to have another ceremony the next day so he could be part of it. He said he realized how disrespectful he had been by choosing that camping trip over my wedding and asking me to reschedule. He admitted I was justified in what I did, but he regretted everything. He just wanted one more chance. He didn't care if no one else showed up, he just needed to know that he had walked his little girl down the aisle. He seemed desperate, and that's what really got to me. It hit me that if I hadn't asked my stepdad to step in, I doubted my father would have cared this much. So I asked him straight out. If I hadn't chosen my stepdad to walk me down the aisle, would he have come rushing back like this? Or would he have just brushed it off and stayed with my brother? He didn't answer right away. That hesitation told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about me. This was about him. About his pride. About his place in my life versus my stepdad's. And that hurt. I told him I was disappointed. That I wasn't going to have another wedding just to make him feel better. He had his chance, and he blew it. All I wanted now was some peace, without him making this about himself. I politely asked him to leave. But he didn't go. He broke down right there in front of me, pleading for forgiveness. He said he was sorry for never putting me first, that he hadn't truly realized I was going to go through with the wedding until he saw that picture. The moment he did, he and my brother got on the next bus home. I held my ground. I told him, once again, that I wanted him to leave because I was still celebrating my wedding, and I wasn't about to let this ruin my night. That's when his sadness turned to offense. He accused me of being heartless, saying I couldn't just treat him this way over one mistake. That set me off. One mistake? I told him that if he could treat me like I didn't matter my entire life, without any good reason, then I had every right to do the same to him, except, in my case, I had plenty of reasons. I told him everything happening to him right now was well-deserved. I told him I was glad I had chosen my stepdad instead because, even though we weren't related by blood, at least he actually cared about me. At least it wasn't just for show. And with that, I walked back inside the house. After a while, I glanced outside, and they were gone. My dad. My brother. Just gone. Now that I've had some time to sit with it, I feel bad about what I said. I feel even worse that I made him cry. I regret that he had to see my stepdad in his place. I regret how I threw it in his face. Update. Hey, everyone. I've spent a lot of time thinking about this, and I've come to a conclusion. I don't actually have anything to be sorry for. At the end of the day, my dad made his choice. He was the one who thought a stupid camping trip with my brother was more important than my wedding. And I've spent my whole life making excuses for him. I'm done with that. There is no justification for what he did. And I don't have to forgive him if I don't want to. Sure, I feel bad that I made him cry, but people can only tolerate being mistreated for so long before they snap. I can't even count the number of times I cried because of how he treated me growing up. And I never let anyone see it, not even him. And even if he had known, I doubt he would have done anything about it. So yeah, I'm at peace with my decision. I talked to my husband about it, and he told me he supports whatever I decide. The only reason he hadn't said anything before was because he wanted it to be my choice and mine alone. That meant a lot to me. I also spoke to my stepdad about it because, honestly, I felt guilty for dragging him into all of this. I didn't want him to feel like I had just used him to get back at my dad. But he brushed it off. He told me that at the end of the day, the fact that I turned to him first still meant something. And I guess that's true. I do value him. And he knows that. As for the people who are upset with me for putting him in the middle of all this, he doesn't mind. And as long as he's not upset, I'm fine with what I did. Anyway, it's been a couple of days since the wedding, and my dad has been trying to reach me. He's been texting and calling every single day, but I haven't answered. I haven't even read his messages, so I have no idea what he's trying to say. And honestly, I don't really want to find out. In just a couple of days, my husband and I will be heading off on our honeymoon, and honestly, I just want to clear my mind and put all of this behind me for a while. Update 2. We're leaving tomorrow, and this morning, my dad called again. As usual, I let it ring. But after a few minutes, I decided to go through the messages he had been sending me. Like I mentioned before, he had been calling me every single day since my wedding, never missing a day. The times varied, but the calls always came. Until now, I hadn't read a single one of his messages, but today, I finally did. They were all more or less the same. The wording changed, but the core message didn't. He was sorry. He kept saying how much he regretted everything and how desperately he wanted to fix things. He admitted that he had been a terrible father, that I had every right to be angry with him, and that I had given him more than enough chances to change, but he had always failed me by putting my brother first. He knew that now, and he understood why I was upset. But at the same time, he reminded me that he was my only surviving biological parent and that he just wanted to be a part of my life. He said he was willing to do whatever it took for me to forgive him. Reading those messages was painful. The whole situation was just sad. But I had already made up my mind. I needed space. After sitting with it for a bit, I decided to call him back. He picked up almost immediately, launching straight into another apology before I could even say a word. But I cut him off. I told him that I had read his messages. I understood that he was sorry, but I needed him to stop calling and texting me for a while. I explained that constantly hearing his apologies wasn't going to change what had already happened. It was only keeping everything fresh in my mind, and I didn't want that. I told him that when I was ready to talk, I would reach out. But for now, I needed him to leave me alone. If he was upset about it, he didn't let it show. He simply said he understood and that he would wait until I was ready. And that was that. Now, all I can think about is how much I'm looking forward to this honeymoon. I just want to leave all this drama behind and enjoy myself for once. Update 3. So, I'm currently on the 3rd day of my honeymoon, and to my surprise, my dad has actually kept his promise. He hasn't tried to reach out, not even once. But unexpectedly, someone else did. And it was completely unnecessary. My brother. He called me this morning, and the moment I heard his voice, I knew exactly why. He wasn't calling to check in on me. He wasn't calling to wish me well. No, he was calling to lecture me about family and to tell me that the way I was treating our father was horrible and that I needed to apologize immediately. The kicker? He called from a burner phone, which is the only reason I even answered. I didn't recognize the number, so I picked up. The second I heard his voice, I was ready to hang up. But then he said something that made me pause. He told me that if I hung up now, it would only prove his point that I was an escapist. And, damn it, he knows exactly how to push my buttons. So, I stayed on the line. He wasted no time launching into his speech. According to him, I couldn't just run away from my family. Whether I liked it or not, our dad was still my dad, and no matter how close I was to my stepdad, he could never replace him. I have no idea why he felt the need to say that to me. It's not like we're kids anymore, back in the middle of the divorce, being forced to pick sides. So, I told him straight up this was between my father and me, and he needed to stay out of it. But he wasn't having it. He told me that because of my hurtful behavior, our dad had been miserable. That the camping trip had been cut short because of me, which ruined his visit. And because of that, this wasn't just between me and our father, it involved all of us. And then, of course, he had to go there. He said he knew for a fact that I had always been jealous of him. That he couldn't do anything about it, but that I had no right to take it out on our dad. That it wasn't our dad's fault for prioritizing the child who had always been there for him, unlike me, who had betrayed him during the divorce. I was stunned. Not because of what he said, I mean, this is classic him, but because of how childish and idiotic he sounded. So, I told him exactly that. I told him that his behavior was pathetic, but honestly, I expected nothing less from a man-child like him. And as for me being jealous? Not in the slightest. If anything, I pity him. Because no matter how successful he is in his career, he's still emotionally stunted. And nothing he accomplishes will ever change that. Before my brother could argue, I cut him off. I told him that if he kept going, it would only prove my point that he was miserable and desperate to convince himself, and everyone else, that he wasn't. Then, without waiting for a response, I hung up. And, honestly, that was pretty damn satisfying. I shouldn't have answered his call in the first place, but at least I got the last word in. Now, for the rest of the trip, I've decided I'm not picking up any calls unless it's an emergency. I just want to enjoy the rest of my honeymoon without any more unnecessary drama. Update 4. I got back home a few days ago, and my husband and I were still in vacation mode for a bit. But yesterday, reality set back in, he had to return to work, and so did I. Now that we're settling back into normal life, I figured it was finally time to confront my dad and have a real conversation with him. So after work today, I went over to his place. He looked surprised to see me, though I'm not sure if it was a good or bad surprise. And, of course, my brother was there too. But I ignored him, he's not exactly a priority in my life. I asked to speak to my dad privately because I didn't want my brother butting in every 2 seconds. I knew he wouldn't be able to keep his mouth shut, and I wasn't in the mood to deal with him. He didn't seem thrilled about being dismissed, but eventually, he left the room, and I finally had a moment alone with my father. Once we were alone, I told him the truth. I told him how disappointed I was. I had really thought things were improving between us. For the past couple of years, we had actually been getting along, which is why I had asked him to walk me down the aisle in the first place. But the second he asked me to reschedule, I knew exactly where I stood. His priorities had never changed. I admitted that asking my stepdad to step in had been petty and a little vindictive, but I also told him that my stepdad was important to me too, just in a different way. And then I asked him the question that had been bothering me all along. Had he rushed back because he genuinely regretted missing my wedding? Or was it just about pride about the fact that my stepdad had taken his place? I told him that, at this point, it didn't even matter. What was done was done. Nothing could change it now. My dad looked upset the whole time I was talking, but he stayed quiet. Then, I told him the decision I had come to. The only way forward was to start fresh. Some people might think I should cut him off entirely, but that wasn't realistic for me, nor was it something I wanted. I've already lost my mother to cancer. I know how cruel life can be, how quickly people can be taken away. And despite everything my dad has done, despite all the ways he's hurt me, there were still good moments. There were still times when he was a father to me, even if they were overshadowed by everything else. But I also couldn't pretend the bad never happened. So, I told him that I was willing to give him another chance, to let him try to fix what he had broken. But not right now. I needed space. I needed time to heal. Maybe it would take weeks. Maybe months. Maybe even years. But when I was ready, we could try again. Until then, I wanted to keep our contact minimal. And then I asked him if he could accept that. He didn't argue. He just nodded. Then, before I left, he asked if he could hug me. So we hugged. It was emotional, but I held it together until I got back to my car. And that's where we left things. For now, at least, this works.